But the lonas, what we found was it actually really increased the productivity, especially by women, by about 30%, virtually closing the gender wage gap.
We are looking at addressing child labor, living wage commitments, forced labor, gender wage gaps.
And there's this misperception of farm workers that they're, in many cases referred to as unskilled laborers. And I find that the opposite is true.
Hi everyone, this is Alexandra Lasota in the next episode of the Sustainability Brief. Today my guest is Quinn, the Senior Regional Lead at Verite, and we are going to dive deep into the findings of the recent project in the coffee industry. So join in.
So I see that you spent 19 years with Verite, which I think for anyone who works on the topic of human rights due diligence is it's a very well-known name, and sooner or later, we all come across that. So Verite is an independent non-profit organization that advances fair labor worldwide since 1996. And currently you are leading the organization's work in the Western Hemisphere as a senior regional lead for the Americas. So tell me, how did you start doing what you're doing right now?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I kind of did everything backwards. So basically at 19, I moved to Guatemala supposedly to study Spanish, similar to what you recently did in Colombia. But I ended up staying there for 3 years, where I worked in human rights organizations, for the Human Rights Ombudsman's Office, in election observation. I got a graduate degree in human rights before I finished my undergraduate degree. And I also had a kid. So I came back to the States to get my undergraduate degree at 22. And I was, deeply interested in human rights and in human security and the impacts of organized crime on local populations and vulnerable groups. But I was a young father in Amherst, Massachusetts, studying at the University of Massachusetts. And honestly, Verite was the sort of the only game in town that did work on international human rights, and also that had a paid internship and a path to a job. And so it wasn't as though sort of labor rights was my core area of interest. But as I began to work at Verite, I really saw very quickly the intersections with the topics that I was most passionate about, right? So broad-based human rights, organized crime, and also just saw that promoting decent labor and improved wages is just a key driver of development and central to everyone's daily experience and dignity. So yeah, as I said, now it's been about almost 20 years. I mostly worked on research and government and foundation funded projects over those 20 years, including working in coffee for the last 15 years. But over the last decade, 7 years or so, I've been increasingly involved in our work with the private sector to promote fair, safe, and legal working conditions around the globe, which is central to what Verite has done over its 30-year history. And really seeing that using the leverage and influence of major international brands can be a huge driver of change on the ground, right? We've seen in many cases, employers are not scared of government because they don't do inspections, right? They're not listening to UN agencies, but they listen to their clients. And so we've seen that as a huge way to advance our mission. Although we're a mission-driven organization, we see that one of the most effective, paths to affecting change is working in partnership with major companies to advance respect for labor rights, both in their supply chains and their own operations. And of course, there's a place for activist organizations, but Verite is generally the organization that takes that impetus for companies to create change and provides practical guidance to do so. And so, I now work as the senior regional lead for the Americas, as you mentioned, and I don't get to go into the field as much as I did before. That's still what is most meaningful to me, is really interacting with workers on the ground, hearing their stories and their priorities.
But nevertheless, I guess you get to make sure that whatever is being covered by your colleagues on the ground really reaches those people in the decision-making power. And speaking about the work of Verite with private sector, so I have come across the project that Verite started implementing in 2017, which really is about improving the conditions in the coffee sector. And so it's really interesting, I think, because you don't only look at decent work topics, but you look at several aspects of the coffee production, right? You look at the farm productivity. So essentially you're looking at margins of profit for farmers. you look at the quality of the product.
Mhm.
And through that lens, you are also looking at how you can actually have a project that achieves a win-win, both for farmers and for the workers, where the farmer gets to keep their margins of profit, but at the same time, the worker increases their earnings. It's, I think, quite interesting time to be talking about coffee, given that 2023 was the hottest day on record in Latin America. 2024 was the second hottest year on that continent, which of course impacts how coffee is produced when we look at the rainfall, when we look at different diseases that affect the crop, and just many other issues. And so, can you tell us a bit more about what is that project that you have implemented? Why did you want to focus on that particular crop? And how does the future of that project looks like?
Yeah, so the coffee project came about really out of a project that we'd originally done in Guatemala, where again I lived for a while between 19 and 22, but then I actually moved back and was based there for Verite for 3 years, and we implemented a project that was funded by the U.S. Department of State and Cure Green Mountain back in the day, which is now Cure Dr. Pepper, and we implemented a grievance mechanism for over 1,000 workers. And so we got funding from the U.S. Department of Labor to actually continue that project and expand the grievance mechanism out across the country. But due to security issues, we actually had to sort of rework that project and move from Guatemala to a more global project. And so this project, funded by the U.S. Department of Labor, the Cooperation on Fair, Free, Equitable Employment Project, we created an open source toolkit for private sector actors, from international retailers and roasters to coffee traders to cooperatives and farms on the ground, with over 40 tools and online training modules. And the purpose of that is to improve labor conditions in the coffee sector. Alongside that, we implemented pilot projects in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. And those pilot projects sought to both pilot the tools on the ground and to pilot cost-effective, mutually beneficial interventions that would be scalable for farmers. And as you mentioned, we look at productivity. We look at things like climate change and the effects on both producers and workers. Because what we've come to realize over our time working in coffee is that it can't just be this top-down model where brands increase the level of rigor of their codes of conduct, which is really important, right? You want international brands and roasters to increase their standards. But in many cases, the impetus is put on farmers, who are the actors in the supply chain with the least level of resourcing to actually affect change. So a company has a living wage commitment. Lots of times the impetus put it on the farmers to then comply with that requirement, but it's many times impossible for farmers to earn a living income while paying workers a living wage. And so the idea for the Colombia pilot was, how do we increase workers' wages without increasing costs for farmers? And ideally, to create tangible and intangible benefits for those farmers. And so what we did is we piloted the use of different tools, canguaros, which are sort of special gloves with netting, and lonas, which is basically specialized plastic sheeting. And the idea was to test out how those different tools could increase worker productivity and thereby their incomes, because they're generally paid piece rates, right, according to the amount of coffee they harvest. And so this means that a farmer would pay the same amount per pound of coffee harvested, but workers could earn more money, right? And that's that kind of win-win solution that's key that you talked about. And so what we found in practice was that the canguaros didn't really work. The workers weren't into adapting them. They felt like the gloves sort of messed with their ability to harvest coffee. But the lonas, what we found was it actually really increased the productivity, especially by women, by about 30%, virtually closing the gender wage gap. And honestly, it was because women worked better together in groups, right? And in addition to that, it decreased those ergonomic risks because they weren't constantly bending over or carrying heavy baskets. They were letting the coffee cherries fall onto the sheeting. And because they also didn't fall on the ground, it also helped with pest control, for example, because they weren't rotting on the ground. And also meant that there was more cherries that they could harvest, and they could control better for quality because they could sort through the cherries that were on the ground. again, this created a lot of tangible benefits for the workers because they were earning a lot more, and the farmers benefited from better quality, more productivity because there's labor shortages. So with fewer workers, they could have the same amount of productivity, and also again decrease pest and improve quality. So this was sort of this kind of win-win solution that we found could benefit both workers and farmers. And furthermore, we did determine that, but this isn't sort of a silver bullet solution. So lonas aren't going to work everywhere because the coffee trees have to be far enough apart to be able to extend the lonas, and it can't be too steep because obviously the coffee cherries are going to roll down the hill, right? And so the idea of this new pilot project is we want to pilot different tools and different approaches to increase productivity and aggression and efficiencies in different types of farms, geographies, countries, and worker populations, and determine which types of tools and approaches work best in different contexts. Because again, it's not like lonas is going to work absolutely everywhere, but we want to put out an overarching report that says, look, if your farm has these types of characteristics, these types of tools and approaches will work best. We've likely gotten funding from 3 different companies. We're sort of in the final stages now of contracting to do pilots in 3 countries in Central and South America. And we also have a lot of interest from industry associations, civil society organizations, and academic institutions to provide both funding and in-kind support to both measure impact as well as the impacts of the project, as well as the impacts on quality, right? And also to provide technical support in terms of agronomists and field technicians, as well as through a coffee trader, which is RGC Coffee, with which we partnered on the pilot in Colombia. And so we've had a lot of interest, and it looks very likely that not for this harvest season, but for next harvest season, we will be rolling that out in at least 3 different countries.
And that's fantastic. Congratulations on that. I think it's great to hear that you will be able to expand geographically. Now, I'm trying to visualize lonas. I mean, I have been to a coffee farm in the past. And so, I mean, what should I imagine? Should I imagine just essentially a plastic sheet that is spread between the coffee trees? How does it look like?
Sure. Yeah. So lonas, yeah, they are basically, specialized plastic sheeting. It's not that's a good thing about these tools. They're not that expensive. They're not, they're something that workers can easily use. They have some barriers in many cases so that the grains don't roll off. But the idea is that you basically extend these out in the veredas, the sort of the path between the coffee trees, and workers can allow the coffee cherries to fall on the ground, and then afterwards sort them and collect them. And so it's not something that's that's groundbreaking in terms of high levels of technology, but it can really change the game in terms of productivity, right? And so these kinds of things take time because many times in cases workers have been harvesting coffee one way their entire life. And so it requires training and it requires a learning curve. And one of the really important things that we do is we subsidize workers' earnings during the time that they're learning how to use these new tools, because workers live day to day, right? And you can't expect them to say, well, I'm going to take a 30% decrease in my income for 2 weeks so that I can have a 30% increase over the rest of the harvest and potentially over the rest of my career, because they can't afford that 30% decrease because their daily earnings might be what they use to go to the market to get food for their children, right? And it's like for me, like you could, I've been writing one way my whole life. And so if you give me a Spanish language keyboard, it's probably I write a lot in Spanish, so it's probably gonna benefit me in the long run. But lots of times I can't afford to slow down and learn over 2 weeks, right? And so it's the same way for workers. Like they have a certain way that they've been used to doing something. So you need to provide support, ongoing training, and to subsidize their wages while they're learning this new technique.
Of course, I guess what you're really dealing with is behavioral change with a population that, as you said, cannot just stop and take a day off to learn how to harvest things in a new way. And just going back, I guess it's really important is that a lot of those workers, as many workers in the agricultural sector, are paid piece rates. So essentially, they're only paid for the amount that they harvest. Can you tell us what are the key challenges with this piece rate system, especially that we know that the climate is changing so much and affecting agriculture so much? So what does it mean for the worker wages?
the piece rate pay is something that, isn't inherently bad, but I have recently written a white paper on piece rate, the link between piece rate pay and a number of different labor risks. And so put that out last year, I think, in the last year. And basically what we found is that, of course, it can result in some minimum wages because workers aren't guaranteed a minimum wage independent of production. But it also results many times in excessively long working hours because workers may have to work well over 8 hours per day in order to earn enough to survive. It also means that you have gender inequality because in many cases women's production is counted towards the male head of household's production, and women in many cases don't even receive the earnings from their work, or they are also responsible for domestic responsibilities. So they may be able to earn, to work fewer hours and earn less than men, right? But you also have impacts on other categories of workers. So, for example, in Colombia, we found that an experienced Colombian harvester could earn about 3 times more than an inexperienced Venezuelan worker, for example. So we interviewed, dentists and engineers who had worked, in agriculture for the first time in their lives, and it's like putting me in a coffee field. I'm going to earn way less than somebody who's done this their whole lives. And there's this misperception of farm workers that they're, in many cases referred to as unskilled laborers. And I find that the opposite is true, right? This is something that people learn over their whole lives. And I think farmers are finally coming to realize these are not replaceable workers. If you bring in a new person who's lived in their city their whole lives, they're not going to have either the physical stamina or the skills that they've learned over their whole lives to not harm the coffee plants and to be able to harvest large quantity of coffee and to pay attention to quality. And so one of my colleagues, Eric Nicholson, who was at the United Farm Workers for many years, it's funny, he forgot that he coined this term. I reminded him a couple of years ago that I read it in the magazine. He called them field baristas and said that
field baristas, interesting.
That farm workers were as important to quality or more so than actual baristas, right, at the end of the supply chain. But they're often not recognized for this. And finally, the piece rate pay also incentivizes child labor because what happens is you have workers earning far less than a living wage, and you have, in many cases, workers migrating as families. There's not any kind of childcare center. They live in galeras and communal housing. And so if I'm a parent, right, and I have an 8-year-old daughter, rather than leaving my daughter alone in communal housing with unknown men, I'm going to bring her to the field. And if the choice is either my daughter can sit on the ground for 8 hours or 12 hours per day while I'm working, or she can help me and have 3 meals rather than 2 meals a day, I'm going to have her work alongside. So it's a very rational response for workers. And because the more they pick, the more they earn, that incentivizes child labor. And so, but we have to make ways for this piece rate system to work because it can also, some workers can earn well above the minimum wage because they are experienced, right? And because they have high levels of productivity. And so, for some workers, it's really beneficial, and workers don't necessarily want to see this go away, but you need to put the necessary controls in place to ensure that workers earn it, at least the minimum wage and preferably a living wage, that, it's not causing gender inequality or child labor, right? And you mentioned climate change. That's also a really important thing, whether it's climate change or pests or crop illness outbreaks. The issue is that anytime producers see something that impacts their productivity or profitability, in many cases, working conditions and wages are the first thing to suffer because the only input, labor is the largest input for farmers in terms of production costs, and it's also the only input that they have control over. So they're not going to control the fertilizer costs, the seedling costs, right? They can't control the prices that they receive for their coffee. The only thing they have control over is labor costs, right? And so if farmers are squeezed, many times it's the workers who end up suffering. And so again, there's really a need to ensure that farmers are able to be profitable because any business has to be profitable, and that you're lifting up both farmers and workers together, because this idea of sort of trickle down economics at the farm level, that doesn't work, right? If you just provide a premium to farmers, that's not necessarily going to be translated to workers. You need to make sure that if coffee prices go up or productivity goes up, workers are also benefiting, not just farmers.
100%. And I think, it's even more important. What I have seen in your briefing note is that the labor costs essentially can be between 40 to 70% of the farmer's cost. So essentially, it means that on every dollar that farmer earns from selling the coffee, that would be between 40 to 70 cents. Is that correct?
Right. That's correct. Yep.
Which is huge. And just going back quickly to the piece rate system, because as you rightfully pointed out, I think that initially, sometime in the past, the piece rate system was designed more as an incentive to incentivize people to work better. Of course, when there is no safety net in place, that doesn't always benefit people. But I know that in your project, you also have been looking at how to encourage workers to prioritize quality over quantity, to essentially pick better beans. So how do you do that?
What we found is that in practice, the lonas allowed for, as I mentioned earlier, for the sorting of coffee when it was on the lona on the ground, so workers could throw away the cherries that were infested with pests or that were not mature. And we also found that workers that were participating in this pilot also were just more invested, right? So they if you have a worker who's being paid well under the minimum wage, and who's, you might have them go from one farm to another each year, looking for slightly better conditions. But if you have a farm that is paying workers well above what they could earn on any other farm because they're providing them with these kinds of tools and training, what we saw is that workers then become invested in the farm, right? They want to see this farm, thrive and become and be profitable, because they want that same job again the next year, because they're not going to be able to earn 30% more in the other farm. And you also have, severe labor shortages in Colombia. And farmers are paying a lot of money to labor recruiters. They're doing things like having raffles and giving away motorcycles to try to get workers to come to their farms. And this is a much more effective way that to ensure worker retention from year to year, and workers being invested in the farms and in quality and in things like pest control. We also saw the workers being more apt to report pests to farmers, because they, again, wanted to see the farm be profitable. But it's also, I think, really important, a way to improve communication between workers and farm management, because you're finding a mutually beneficial area, right? Focusing on productivity that allows for more open communication with workers saying, look, if we did this a little bit differently, I could increase my productivity, and this is going to benefit both of us. And so that helped to increase dialogue. And so that can also increase dialogue around things like pest control and quality, and workers can make more suggestions to farmers. And also, the idea is over time that as that trust is built up, they can also be more communicative about, whether a supervisor is engaging in sexual harassment, right? This kind of opening of communication is really important for other areas as well.
So I hear a lot of benefits in the approaches that you're testing. So essentially, it's the increased retention, it's the increased ownership of workers over essentially the plantations at which they are working. It's the improved communication between the workers and the employers. Now, a question. So I think, essentially the benefits for people, and I would say also to farmers, are quite clear. Now, if we have any corporate sustainability professionals who are listening to us, and now they want to go back internally and say, I would also like to engage in a project like that and see how can I be working throughout my supply chain and actually at the bottom of it with farmers. What are some of the arguments that they could be using internally to market for a project like that?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really important one. So I think, first, it's a relatively small initial investment in doing this kind of pilots that can help to identify scalable models to address a number of different company priorities. So one, we've seen many companies making pledges to promote compliance with living wage across their supply chains. And what we found in many cases is that companies are quite far from, in the coffee sector, many places employers are quite far from even having minimum wage compliance, let alone living wage compliance. I can give you an example. And we did a study recently in Mexico under the local project. It was coffee, cocoa, and sugarcane. But across those three crops, we found that workers were earning on average about 227 pesos per day, which is about $12 a day. And that's slightly under the minimum wage on average. But we found that it was about they were earning about half of the living wage in Chiapas in Mexico, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's again, there's no way that you can just tell a farmer, as you mentioned, it's already 40 to 70% of their costs. Okay, we want you to, so that we can comply with our living wage commitment, we now need you to double workers' wages, right? Because that's what it would mean. And so how are you going to work towards those living wage commitments? It's not just about putting out the requirements, it's about providing farmers with tools and models so that they can meet these commitments in an economically sustainable way, right? And so that's really important. The other commitments that can, there's a lot of focus on closing gender wage gaps. So this again can help to close gender wage gaps. You can focus on women or focus on tools that can be beneficial to women and ensure that their production and earnings are recognized and paid out directly to them. It can also help companies meet their child labor commitments. As I said, again, the way that this is, if a worker is earning well under a living wage, they may, literally depend on their children's, work and production in order to provide them with sufficient nutrition, right? You can see some of the countries that we work in. Guatemala, for example, it's the country after Haiti with the second highest level of malnutrition in the Western Hemisphere, right? And so you have workers who, have their children working alongside them literally so they can give their children enough food to thrive and grow, right? And so ensuring that workers are earning enough and that they're not being incentivized to bring their children to the farms with them, or really required out of economic necessity to bring their children to the farms with them is really important as well. And another thing is securing future coffee supply, right? So we've seen severe labor shortages in Colombia, for example. If it hadn't been for the Venezuelan refugee crisis a few years back, about half of Colombia's coffee went unharvested, and then they were saved by refugees, right? But we're getting to a point where we're seeing countries that have traditionally been countries of origin of migrant workers that are seeing severe labor shortages. So Mexico and Honduras, we've seen over 100,000 Guatemalan workers migrating to Honduras, which is a country with higher rates of poverty and violence than Guatemala, to harvest coffee because there's severe labor shortages in Honduras, right? And so the new generation of workers does not want to work in coffee because they're not paid adequately and they're not respected, and it's not seen as a profession where they can thrive. And so it's really important for the future of the coffee supply that we have a new generation of workers that's interested in working in the sector. And under the current wage structures, that's not going to happen. The other part is increasing quality, right? So again, if you have workers, if you have other types of tools and harvesting techniques, either that provide a premium for quality or that allow workers to better control for quality, such as the lonas, or that workers are simply more invested in the profitability and future of the farm because they realize this is better than what they're going to get on other farms, you're going to have impacts on quality. And then, as I mentioned, finally, that communication is really important. So if you have workers proactively communicating with farmers before there are major problems related to sexual harassment and abuse or forced labor, child labor, you can address legal and reputational risks for companies, especially risks around forced labor, which is really the biggest legal risk right now with the expansion of forced labor import bans.
And I think this is an excellent breakdown. So what I have noted here is that essentially we are looking at killing several birds with one stone. So we are looking at addressing child labor, living wage commitments, forced labor, gender wage gaps. We are looking at securing future coffee supply, and then really making the sector much more attractive to workers because, as you mentioned, it is facing severe labor shortages. It's also looking at increasing the quality of the product itself. And lastly, making the grievance mechanisms more effective, especially as essentially we are seeing a lot of violations, exploitation, and also the countries that you mentioned. I mean, Colombia, Mexico, Colombia in particular, hosts the third largest population of Venezuelan refugees, which is 2.8 million. And of course, whenever we see people who are on the move, people who are in a vulnerable situation, those cases of exploitation just pop up out of nowhere. And so it seems that your project can potentially help address some of those issues to a large extent. And my last question, so what is the key takeaway that you would like to leave the audience with?
So I think that one of the really important takeaways that we found is that these kinds of labor issues are complex issues that can only be solved through collective action. So again, we can't put the impetus on farmers, who are the individuals with the least amount of resources in the whole supply chain, to say, okay, now it's your responsibility to pay living wages, to control child labor, to ensure that there's no forced labor, to gender-based discrimination, right? It requires collaboration across different actors in supply chain. So you need the roasters and retailers to be involved to ensure that and to encourage participation of traders and cooperatives to get the types of tools and information to farmers to support them. So again, we have these open source tools. They're free, they're downloadable, they're in English, Spanish, Portuguese. There's simple tools for small farmers. There are much more sophisticated tools for larger farmers, traders, and roasters. And cooperatives, but roasters need to get these tools into the hands of farmers. And they also need to fund these kinds of pilots so that they can develop cost-effective approaches to ensure compliance with their codes of conduct. And then we also need support from industry associations, key industry groups focused on research and quality, governments, foundations, and civil society to ensure that there is broad uptake across the sector.
Fantastic. I do hope that some of those are listening and will be knocking on your doors to essentially ask how can they expand and how can they join, because it does seem that there are some very tangible impacts for people that are being achieved through your project, and hopefully that work can keep going. So thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure to have you.
All right, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
And that's it for now. Thanks for listening.